Hello, and thank you for joining our session. It's not too late. NGOs addressing inequality and privilege in the sector. Across international development and humanitarian field, consensus is growing to use an international framework to challenge persistent inequalities for NGOs and for our organizations to work in ways that are inclusive, equitable, and not based on colonial models of engagement. Development and humanitarian actors are expected to understand the identities of race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, religion, age, and class, and that they are all each vast and complex, and increasingly so as identities intersect across categories and cultures. As a result, INGOs have a responsibility to center the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion internally within their operations and externally for their missions and programming. Guided by the principles of do no harm, Interaction is developing a collective, comprehensive DEI approach for our coalition to model as a mission-driven thought leader and standard bearer. We're called to be better integrating with our diversity, equity, inclusion work across the INGO sector. We have with us in this session 3 such standard barriers to discuss why it's not too late for NGOs to address inequality and privilege in the sector. I will briefly introduce our speakers, and they each will share more about their background and their responses. First, I'd like to introduce Matoni Mariah, who is the former Senior Director of International Programming at Oxfam America, and she is also an Interaction Fellow. She led the development of Oxfam's 10-year global strategic framework entitled Fighting Inequality to End Poverty and Justice. Before joining Oxfam in 2001, Matoni worked with various regional organizations in Africa, focusing on international policy and development, and she is keen on the application of systems thinking to harness collaboration across the development sector. Next, I would like to introduce Marlisa Gamblin. She is the Senior Domestic Policy Advisor for Racial and Gender Divides at Bread for the Road Institute. Marlisa is a dynamics public speaker, a racial equity coach, a thoughtful researcher, and the founder of Gambling Consults, a racial equity consulting company. At Bread for the Road Institute, she uses her expertise to provide research and analysis on closing the racial and gender hunger and income divides. Marlisa built the methodology to apply a racial equity lens to anti-hunger policies, and most recently, she designed the Racial Equity Scorecard, a tool that has helped policymakers, organizations, and communities rate their policies and programs when promoting racial equity. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Atena Hinch, a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and the principal consultant at Hinch Consulting. She has 17 years of experience in diversity and inclusion globally, working in Oceania, Europe, and the Middle East with numerous organizations and leaders. Atena consulted with IFRC and their full revision of their gender and diversity organizational assessment toolkit. From this process, Atena has deep learning on the challenges and lessons learned in her experience. And for her, in her experience, the process of creating a tool is equally as educational and impactful as the final product itself. Let's jump in with the first group question. And so my question to everyone, from your work, what have you seen as the principal issues holding the sector back from being diverse, equitable, and inclusive? And Matoni, we're going to start with you.
Great. And thank you, Princess, for inviting me to speak on such a great panel. I already know how I will follow up with my colleagues. So, for a sector that exists to reshape values and social norms, increase equity and social cohesion, we really struggle to speak truth to power, at least internally. And I believe that part of this dissonance comes from the fact that we're mission-driven organizations, and our missions often reflect really high ideals, and yet, when confronted, we fall back on the types of avoidance mechanisms that we criticize rights bearers and policymakers for. So We have all made huge investments in understanding rights-based approaches, and our missions put these front and center. However, we still struggle to share power, whether this is with partners or internally with staff in all their diversity. There seems to be a fear of what lies at the heart of power sharing. And so we often settle for pseudo change because it seems safe. And diversity and inclusion goes straight to the heart of the power issue. So all the debates on decolonizing the sector, leaving no one behind, nothing about us without us will always come back to sharing power. And the work that we need to do is to transcend that fear. So we're not going to be able to turn away from these issues. So the whole system, from donors to foundations, different types of development organizations, even movements, all of us, we will need to figure out new ways of relating and preparing people and organizations for major culture shifts. Thanks.
So I'll go next. I just want to, first of all, say thank you, Matoni. That was amazing. I have my notes out and I'm like, you just, hit on 3 of the 5 things that I had. So I just want to say
repetition is good.
Repetition is good. So that's why I'm going to indulge in it. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you, Princess, for having me. I want to really build on what Matoni said, which is there is a disconnect between the ideal of what a lot of INGOs are espousing to be and the reality of really where a lot of us are. So I think being real and understanding what the ideal is and not just assuming that because you have that ideal that you're somehow living into that ideal, but rather being real about the disconnect between the ideal and the reality is so key. I would say another piece is that we're not assigning the resources needed to tackle the problem. I am super, super, super big on decolonizing the INGO just apparatus, if you will, because it's so big, as Matoni mentioned, right? It's donors, it's the actual organizations talking about, it's an apparatus, and that needs to be decolonized. And when we think about the origins of colonization, then it's important to understand that this did not just happen 100 years ago. This did not just happen 200 years ago. This did not just happen 300 years ago. We need to think about proportionate support in proportion to the amount of time, right, that Black and brown countries have been colonialized by their white counterparts. That is an honest conversation. And you can't just put 10% of your budget towards DEI work that promotes racial equity and expect for that somehow to make a dent. I think the other piece is expecting change, but only making small adjustments. All of this is really undergirded in white fragility, if we're being completely honest. And when we're talking about decolonializing the INGO apparatus, then that means the only way that we have colonialization is as a result of white supremacy. So we have to be really intentional about naming that. And then the other piece is that we need to be intentional about naming it in a way where we're not afraid of addressing white fragility. That is a huge thing. The main reason why it's been kind of like small shifts and why it's been difficult to kind of look in the mirror is because a lot of these organizations are headed by white people who, quite frankly, are experiencing themselves white fragility and are also maybe apprehensive about some of the backlash of white fragility that their donor base will bring if they start speaking about these issues, as well as even their staff and membership. This is an issue that we really need to address head on. And the other piece that I will say is once we deal with this, then we can start making the time to make it a priority. Because that's something I also hear. It's like, oh, I have all this stuff. Oh, let's tack on racial equity. No. Racial equity needs to be at the center, right? And it can only be at the center if we're serious about tackling white supremacy first.
Thank you so much. I will go next, and I'm really, really happy to be among you, lady, because you exactly said what I want to say. Thank you. I think I add a couple of other things. What I call it PSTC, which is basically power, as you indicated very clearly, the power structure in order to decolonizing humanitarian aid, and also the other. S is about the structure. The structure itself also reinforces the power. And one of the challenges that we have often with the INGO is about the structures that, for example, North versus South, and for example, Western organization, as you indicated, about the power going to African countries or, for example, South American countries, and in order to really providing the humanitarian aid. So the thing is that the structure, and then we see in regards to the power, not only in the organization levels, but also in the individual levels. We see, for example, local staff versus the expat or international humanitarian aid workers. So we see the power imbalance again, which comes through the structure of the organization, but also a structure of the way that our funders work. For instance, usually when we talk about the power and the structure, we often have the powerful INGOs. Usually they are the one that they have powerful government organizations, so they actually give them a lot of money. They would be able to provide the assistance and support when it's needed. But the issue is that also it means that they, as Melissa mentioned as well, usually they have the power around the table. So you have people from, for example, let's say Scandinavian countries, or from West European country, or from North American country, in around those tables making decisions, and that brings to the concept of the trust, because that's the other power structure, trust, and culture. These are the four things that I see is holding us back from being inclusive in the sectors and equitable. So the concept of the trust, we have to recognize that the trust is earned, is not given. It's also very, very important to build that trust, to develop that trust, and trusting the people let's say the locals to actually take the action to do it, really working capacity building together in order for them to take the ownership of the program rather than is being imposed to them. Because again, the concept of the power, because for example, this organization, they have money, they come to the country to provide this particular program. And the other thing is about the culture, and as it was mentioned as well, when we talk about the power, it creates a culture that Western approach is right. But actually, we have to really demystify that not all the approach, not all the ways that, for example, it's been kind of dictated from the Western and from the North is really appropriate for all the situation. We really need to sit around the table through the intercultural dialogue, through the really equal respect, equal power around the table, and really understand what are the barriers, and really developing the culture of the organization that's inclusive at every level.
Thank you, each of you. And I think as we listen to some of your answers, these buckets, these reoccurring themes really fall under the power dynamics, the structure, all being very principled, like just across the board, huge issues that are holding us back. And so, speaking of structure of this sector and the dynamics of it, Antonia, I'm going to go to you with a question. You led an intensive global process for Oxfam to build a 10-year strategic framework of fighting inequality to end poverty and justice. Walk us through developing that framework, the goals and the outcomes, especially for an organization working in over 90 countries.
I'll start by noting that what the primary drivers behind deciding when to create this framework, and also the context that we were responding to, are really important in understanding the approach that we chose. So I'll start by noting that Oxfam, we delayed the development of the global strategic framework in order to do some important internal work. We needed to engage in a deep transformative process that was ignited in part by the global safeguarding crisis that you'll be aware of. And we wanted to use the learning from that to inform who we wanted to be, what we wanted to do, should we shift the things that we were doing, and more importantly, how we showed up in the world that we were trying to influence and support. It was important that we understand what changes we needed to put in place in order to rebuild trust between Oxfam and all of its stakeholders, and in particular, it's our staff and program participants. So as part of our process, we set out to create a framework that would allow us to respect global balance. Good place to start. We wanted it to be simple, a framework that was simple and based on knowledge. So we had a belief in global balance that was part of what we called Vision 2020. And we were committed to strengthening our accountability, legitimacy, and our relevance by becoming a lot more rooted in the countries where we work. So Athena's point about becoming rooted in countries is really significant. We wanted to simplify the way we worked so that we strengthened our ability to be not only efficient, but also effective. To do that, we needed to work on greater integration and collaboration. And in that way, we thought we would build our ability to influence change and to run better quality programs through sharing of knowledge, etc., both within the Confederation and beyond Oxfam. So from the outset, we wanted to design and deliver something that was bold, inspiring, and that would be a unifying vision for the future. So we thought that the process needed to re-energize our 8,000 staff and partners who had gone through quite a rough time during this transformative process and a change process that we had done to become more efficient. We reflected on our core values of empowerment, inclusiveness, and accountability, wanted to make sure that those were reflected and wanted to test them as well. And the most important ingredient to the success of this process was that it was inspired and guided by the principles of feminist leadership. Those ran through every part of the process, and we used feminist leadership and principles as a litmus test as we went through the process. Rather than a 5 to 7 year strategic plan, we wanted to develop a 10-year foresight-based framework with near-term horizon plans and a midterm pathway that would serve as a tool that we could all use to respond to contexts, whether you were in Fiji or Samoa, or you were in Niger or El Salvador. Another key aspect of the process that we put together was separating design from decision-making. It sounds simple, but what we wanted to do was to guarantee inclusiveness and empowerment. So during the process, We wanted to go through the process and then make decisions on priorities at the end of the process. That was the only way that we were going to be able to create space. So we adopted what we called an outside-in approach. So we started by looking at the outside, talking to people outside. And this was a way of making sure that the strategy was not only locally rooted, but that it was relevant and responsive to the people we work for. And this is critical, and that it would acknowledge how quickly external context changes, as we saw in 2020. We had to make sure that the spaces that we created for design and development of the framework were protected. Otherwise, staff and stakeholders would not trust the process and would not participate. So we created what we called participatory decision-finding spaces and mechanisms at both the country and global level that continuously tested and polled emerging ideas. They looked at options and priorities, and we did all of this using technology for feedback and consultation, and also offered face-to-face opportunities for dialogue and co-creation. The process ended up allowing for really wide geopolitical representation from countries and regions. And this was really important if it was to be a framework that was owned. The highlight of this highly inclusive and collaborative process was a global strategy forum where fully 50% of the participants were external to Oxfam. And the decisions that were made at that forum were the basis of the 10-year strategic framework that you can find on Oxfam's website. And we're very faithful to the outcomes of that forum. The other interesting aspect I wanted to mention of this process was the global team that was pulled together to design and manage the process. They were an empowered, cross-regional, cross-functional, cross-hierarchical group that partnered with existing information and coordination. That was very important to partner with processes that existed, because it helped to situate the process within regular business, as opposed to the strategy process being this process that just happened on the side. And then finally, the approach. We used scenario forecasts, and we made sure we chose this because it would engage all parts of Oxfam, including countries, specific communities of practice, and would include external consultation and feedback alongside your traditional trends analysis, etc. We made sure that we created time, space, put resources to provide opportunities for understanding and engaging with scenario planning as a foresight methodology, as well as in-depth training for local facilitators that we offered virtually in the first phase of the process. So it's important to note that this methodology of scenario planning allowed for a level of customization that was actually quite incredible. So we were able to reflect local context because we could customize all the scanning, planning, contributions, co-creation, consultation processes. All of this included partners and external collaborators. We ended up producing 230 mini scenarios that we called vignettes from around the world. And these informed 5 global scenarios that led to the choices of the 4 systems that we're going to engage with over the next 10 years. And to finish, in addition to the decentralized scenario and horizon planning, we invested very heavily in effective internal communication. And this was a critical component of creating Oxfam-wide ownership of the process. This communication included regular and easily accessible updates and two-way communication channels, as well as responsible feedback loops in something we called radical transparency. So every part of the process, every product, all the data we collected, everything was available to everybody all the time and regularly. And the result, I believe, is a progressive vision and guide that allows different parts of Oxfam and our partners to contribute to the collective mission. Thank you.
No, well, thank you, Matoni. That was a really great overview and really succinct. It gave us a really good insight into the process. And I just want to add here that you mentioned that the framework is on Oxfam's website, but it's also uploaded here for participants to look at as they are on our agenda and also on the session streaming. So you can click on the document and look at that, and also the other documents that our guests will be speaking to. And we'll also include some toolkits related to disability inclusion and other forms of DIY work that we found that our coalitions are doing across the world. And so I just want to let you all know that that document is available. I wanted to talk a little bit about the methodology that you led in the creation to apply a racial equity lens to anti-hunger policies. In that methodology, Bread for the World Institute poses a very interesting question. What does it mean to center the needs of communities of color? My question to you is, how has the racial equity methodology helped Bread to answer that question and better serve communities of color?
Thank you, Princess. So I would first actually not like to assume that people know what centering the needs, leadership, and power of people of color is first. And then I'd love to answer that. So the methodology tool, just for folks who are like, oh my gosh, what is this? The methodology tool is a 3-page tool that essentially is not only for anti-hunger policies, it's actually for transit, INGO, really whatever kind of programs, projects that you're working on. It literally does not matter. When you're dealing with data and when you're dealing with analyzing and just the creation of a solution, I think you might find the methodology as just a really good tool. And it walks you through 5 stages that you really should be going through. I know that my brain as an anti-racist, I'm always thinking about, but a lot of the times, especially at predominantly white NGOs, folks are not really thinking about it. It's not really front of mind. So this tool really allows you to kind of go through that. And there are specific questions. This is a really good tool for researchers as well, so that it literally provides each question you should be thinking about in each section. And something that I really like about it is it focuses on centering communities of color. And when we say centering communities of color, we're talking about centering their voices, centering their expertise, widening our understanding of what expertise means to include and prioritize lived experience with colonialization, for example. That is important. Expertise is not just the fact that I went to an Ivy League school, right? Because that only reinforces colonialization. We need to really be thinking about even how our qualifications of what an expert is when we're saying, oh, well, let's have a roundtable, bring experts in. Well, how can we decolonize what we mean by that, right? So making sure that we're centering voices, lived experience, all of this, right, of people who are living in countries of color that have been historically colonized by white people, institutions, and nations, right? At the beginning, before something becomes like a design, right? Or like a set decision, when it's an idea phase, right? Typically speaking, a lot of times we have not included communities of color in general. And then if we have, it's been on the participatory part, where essentially we already have an idea. We basically made a decision, but we're like, oh, like, let's go ahead and see what you think, you know, like, let's get your sign on so that we can kind of check the box, right? That is not centering communities of color, okay? So centering communities of color means that we have veto power. It means that our voices are actually heard. We're taking up the space, right? And we're making decisions by us, for us, right? And when it comes to the international space, we're really talking about by our country, for our country, okay? That's what we're talking about. So in answering your question, Princess, I think some of the things that I've learned, and I think you know, as a result, Brad has learned, is really the importance of the internal work, right? The methodology is really difficult to carry out if you do not have a racially representative staff. And I don't say diverse staff, because I think a lot of the times people use that term problematically. And you can have racial, like, sprinkles, I like to say, like sprinkles of color, right? In a predominantly white organizations, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's racially represented at all levels, right? And the way that I like to think about racial representation is more so in line with the scope of the problem, right? So whatever you are talking about, like if you are talking about nutrition, for example, then it needs to be in scope of the like maybe nutrition rates like per country. You know, like we're making sure that it's in proportion to whatever issue we're talking about, so that we can make sure that the folks with lived experience are represented at the staff level at all levels of the organization, right? So that's one thing, because it's difficult to carry out the methodology without that internal work. I think the other thing is the importance of decision making, which gets back to the first question where my colleagues talked about power sharing. Right? A key attribute of white supremacy is power hoarding. But with decision making, it really kind of begs the question of like, who's making the decision versus who is being asked to be at like advisory role, right? And not actually hold power, but they're asked to share their expertise, right? So that's another thing, is really kind of interrogating and changing the way in which you make decisions. Right? For all of the things that I produce, because I am a practicing anti-racist, I am very proud to say that all the things I produce, I make sure is approved by the people of color with lived experience with whom I am working with. That is so important, okay? That requires that I myself as a researcher am humble, and that I myself as a researcher am not trying to power hoard. Even though I have lived experience of the issues that I'm working with, I acknowledge the fact that I have privilege because I graduated from an Ivy League school. And I also acknowledge the fact that I am removed from the issues that I'm working with because I am making an income that's higher than the issues that I'm working with, right? So that's all critically important, even as a person of color. So if I'm doing this as a person of color, even more so for a white person who has not experienced racism, right? So that's also important. The other thing I'd like to say is I've also designed the racial equity scorecard, which will also be available online as well. And I just want to encourage folks, use that in addition to the methodology, use both. The methodology provides very concrete questions that you and your organization should be asking yourself. It really makes it to where it's like, what's equitable engagement versus participatory engagement? It actually lays that out so where you don't have any questions. But the scorecard is a really good tool for you to use too, so that you can actually figure out, well, where does my decision making, where does my program design, where does the policy that I'm supporting actually lie on a scale of 0 through 5 when it comes to promoting racial equity? And go figure, the first principle on the racial equity policy and program scorecard is to center the leadership, the power, and the experience of people of color. When we translate that into the international context, it'll be people of color living in countries that have been colonialized by white nations, right? Do that first and foremost, and it needs to be in the idea phase, in the design phase, in the implementation phase, and then the evaluation phase, all throughout. Nothing for us without us. We need to not only be at the table, but we need to be leading the table, which means that we need the space, right, and the respect to actually do that. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. I think that you covered it really well. And I just want to actually highlight one of your points, that the scorecard and the methodology, as you said, is definitely applicable across topic areas, across organizations. So I really encourage you all to take a look at it and utilize this great research. Thank you so much for sharing. Next, Atena, the question I have for you is, you were hired as a consultant to not create a new DEI strategy or tool, but to revise and update an older one, specifically IFRC's Gender and Diversity Organizational Assessment Tool. What are some of the challenges and lessons learned from that revision process with an international NGO?
Thank you so much for that question. So I'd give you a little bit of background in regards to the assessment. So the assessment originally was established in 2016, and it was the idea to be used for 192 national societies. So IFRC is a umbrella organizations for National Society, Red Cross and Red Crescent around the globe. So this toolkit is supposed to look at the five thematic area, which is political will and leadership, and organizational culture, resources and capacity, as well as program delivery, which is community engagement and accountability. So the idea of this toolkit is that when we look at the concept of the gender diversity or diversity, equity, inclusion, we are not looking only internally, for example, treating it as HR, but also at every level of the organization. As we discussed about, for example, holistic approach is looking at the every level of the organization. Is really the leadership or, for example, really the leaders of the organization are willing to do any change, and also how is the policies and procedures within the organization is equipped with gender and diversity lenses. Or, for example, when we are looking at the accountability and integrity of a national society, how diversity, equity, and inclusion taken into the consideration. So this was as a result of a number of policy and strategy within the organizations, such as gender and diversity policy, which is recently about not recently, but 2019, December 2019 was taken into consideration and accepted by the National Society around the globe. And so that was the toolkit that was developed in 2016. However, one of the things that it was noticed that many national society didn't use it. So the idea that why this toolkit is sitting and not being used, and so that was my position came in place, that actually to look at this toolkit and really seeing what are the revision is required and why it's not being used, and so number of challenges that it came from basically looking at this revision. And they were, for example, the first aspect was that is this toolkit approaching in a way that is feasible. And that was one of the things that it was, for instance, people were indicating that they really want to use the toolkit, but for example, is it really feasible, the process that they have to go to through. And also the other thing is that sometimes considering that we have those kind of toolkit, but sometimes they are sit as an orphan. They are not connected with other toolkit that is already exists. And so that was the other challenge. And also the other thing is that the role of statutory commitment toward using, for example, considering that the toolkit is being used and across the organization. And also the leadership buy-in, for instance, how to make leaders buy-in and how to link it to the integrity and accountability. So these are also some of the challenges. And in regards to the lesson learned, so when we were so the way that the toolkit was revised, when we talk about the challenges, but also it means that opportunity. So when we have challenges, means that we can change them into opportunity, and really using it in a way that it can provide better approaches. So for example, in regards to inexpensive, how can we make the assessment inexpensive, and also the organization can use this one to reduce and eliminate existing inequality, was one of the idea that it came out. How about, for instance, we some of the national society can work together in order to really support each other to do this assessment. So as a result, one of the things that came from the consultation, we had quite a good number of people around the globe to do the consultation. So there was number of focus group discussions, number of individual interviews, as well as the survey. So it was kind of comprehensive to really looking what are the challenges and how these challenges can be solved. So as part of the going forward, one of the things that came out, how, for example, to support organizations to help each other to really kind of peer support. And the other things that came out, that how it is possible to do a self-assessment, because often when we do these kind of assessments, it's been looked at, oh, someone from external organization should come and do the assessment. But also it's part of it is possible to do looking internally, looking inside and seeing that what are the things we can do, what are the kind of immediate changes required, but also working with other national society and really collaborating. So that's the other things that came out is a self-assessment toolkit that came out of it. And by the way, the latest version that it will be in the next few months, it will be coming out, and it will be replacing the old version that is on the website. So I just wanted to indicate that. And also the other thing is that a lot of national society came and said that one thing that we want to about the toolkit is to be user friendly in a way that we can actually adopt it, because this toolkit is not only looking at the for example at one area, but actually looking at all the aspects of intersectionality. For example, how to make sure that your organizations is inclusive for persons with disability, not only physical disability but also other aspects of neurodiversity, but also at the same time considering that race, ethnicity, faith, all those aspects, how to making sure that this toolkit is really covering all those areas. And of course it is in a way, it is designed in a way that a national society, for example, may more focusing on disability would be able to use it by adopting some of the area, but also another national society who may be focusing more on the ethnicity or race and caste, for example, they can make sure that it's appropriate for their use. And also the other things that the other lesson learned was that DEI needs to become underlying everything that we do. So that is why the resource, this toolkit, was designed to look at all the aspects with internally, as well as the leadership wheels, as well as HR, recruitment and retention, plus also when we are looking externally. So it looks at all the aspects, and these are a number of the lesson learned.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you all. I think you gave us really great examples of different starting points on this journey, which is really important, starting with revamping an entire organization's framework and looking 10 years ahead, looking at work that you're already doing and applying, as you said, different types of lenses to this work, and using a scorecard to do your current work. And then, ending us off with a great example of, if you have things that you've already created, but it needs to be updated, it needs to be more applicable for people to use and for it to be useful. I think that you've given us some really great examples. And so I want to thank each of you for joining us and taking the time today, and most importantly, for just adding to the body of knowledge and work and research in this area for the INGO sector. I want to quickly invite everyone to join the 1045 Learning Lounge, which is called D&I is the New Currency. to delve more into D&I opportunities in our sector. And if you have any questions or want to get involved in Interaction's Coalition DEI approach, please contact me at Interaction. And with that, thank you to our guests and thank you to all of you for joining us.